And before we begin, I'd like to officially introduce Anne. And we're so excited to have her kick off our series this year. Dr. Anne Sullivan is an assistant professor in digital media and head of the Storycraft Lab at Georgia Tech. She's also a game developer, designer, an illustrator, a quilter, a design instructor, and an animal foster. She received her PhD in computer science from University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research focuses on playful and storied interactive digital experiences from a feminist and humanistic perspective, and studying craft as an analog counterpart to this. Anne is also the concept designer and producer of Luminary, a digitally game system controlled with a loom, which has been shown internationally, including at the SAM arcade exhibit at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So please join me in welcoming Anne, and the virtual mic off to her.
My name is Anne Sullivan, and I wanted to talk about critical making through computational craft. I do interdisciplinary work, and so this is a subset of what I'm doing, but I felt like the part that would be interesting to this audience. So I wanted to just start with giving a little bit of my background because it helps give you the context and the framing of the work I do and where I'm coming from. As mentioned, my formal education is in computer science. That's what my PhD is in. And I also have over a decade of experience working in the tech industry as a game designer and developer, among other things. And when I went back for my PhD, I was mostly focused on artificial intelligence and storytelling. But I actually ended up in computer science through sheer luck. So growing up, my family was very poor. We were actually, we were homeless for a while. And so crafting was this really big part of my childhood. You know, we made our own clothes, we made our, we would make our bedding and things like this, but also cross stitch and embroidery was a very important part of coming together. Every single holiday was about the women going into a room and we'd do cross stitch together and talk. And, you know, it was my chance to, as the only female child, I got to really enjoy feeling like a part of the adults that way. And the way that I got into coding, like I said, was sheer luck. My dad made a very risky business choice back in the 80s in which he decided that he would learn about computers and quit his business focus on TV repair. It obviously worked out okay for him, but that meant we had a computer at home, and so I would program for fun. And like over the summers, I would build and repair computers for my dad. That's just kind of what I grew up with. But I wanted to be an artist, so I spent a lot of time taking art classes, but I was, in the end, just because of the way my family grew up, they were very concerned about monetary things and stability when it comes to finances. And so I was sort of encouraged to go into the sciences because art at the time did not feel like a stable career. But I never lost my love of it. So I've continually been taking art and illustration and graphic design courses. And I always kind of had a side gig of and I still do, of doing illustration and artwork and graphic design. And so this is actually a recent puzzle design that I did as a collaboration with Nervous System. And the way I actually got into computer science in the end was actually due to misreading the majors that were offered at UC Santa Cruz. I, like I said, I was interested in sciences, but I was interested in wildlife conservation. And so that's what I enrolled in. But when I got there, it turned out it was wildland conservation and very different. So we were required to take a computer course because this was back in the early 90s. And so the courses were very much like, this is a mouse, this is a monitor. And because I'd grown up around computers, I was just like, I don't want to take that class. And so I just signed up for the beginning programming class because I had been doing it for fun, and I ended up loving it. But it was interesting because I had never known that that was a viable career path. Otherwise, I might have started out there because at the time they just weren't telling women about computer science. Should I be monitoring the chat? Okay. So, okay, thank you. So yeah, anyway, I ended up in computer science. I loved it. That's what I did for my career. But the entire time I was doing that, I was often the only woman in classes or in my jobs, certainly in meetings and whatnot. And so I spent a lot of that decade plus, probably 2 decades at that point, trying to fit in. And so that meant turning away from a lot of the girly aspects, including crafting. So I kind of quit crafting for a couple decades. But in the end, during grad school, I actually ended up returning to crafting because I needed a creative outlet. And so crafting just made sense. We had seen some really fun, I say we, a colleague of mine that I became very good friends with, we ended up going down this crafting rabbit hole together. And so one of the things I started doing was quilting, and I ended up joining the quilting community in the area where we were at school. And just, you know, really, it was the first time I was in a community in which I didn't have to hide like the girly aspects of myself. And so it was just a very different experience, but it also helped me appreciate like I am more than just what I had to appear to be in some of these programming places. So after my PhD, I actually was part of a startup for 3 years called Playcrafts, in which we were designing software tools for crafters. And we were really focused on playful interfaces and incorporating UI UX that we had learned. And it was really designed with the quilter's needs in mind, which was a nice change from the CS focused work I had been doing for my PhD. But in the end, I really missed research. And so I ended up going back into academia. But I realized once I stopped trying to fit in and just kind of embraced the coding and the craft and the art and all of these different aspects, that is when I felt most fulfilled. And so it ended up becoming the foundation of my research. So even though my PhD is storytelling and AI, my research since then has really shifted. So these go forward, there we go. The other thing that I really noticed is that, you know, things had obviously changed since I'd been a crafter in the 80s. And also because I was starting to explore more of the humanities and more of the arts, I became a lot more critical about the CS work I'd been doing, but also the work that I'm currently doing. And, you know, it's taken a couple more decades, but I've come to terms, well, I'm still coming to terms, but I am much more comfortable now with my own queer and neurodivergent identity. And so this really comes through my work. And there's also been some coming to terms with a distinct change in socioeconomic status, but still being aware of the issues that are, you know, still very present, even though that's not my life anymore. And so, you know, I try to be aware that I'm afforded the privileges of a middle class, white, straight passing and cis passing person. And obviously that limits my embodied experiences. So I try to continue questioning my work, and that's what's going to come up in this talk. And I try to remain open to critique from others with different life experiences. So I say that because I am going to talk about this stuff, and I do welcome critique and questions, and I will do my best to not be defensive and be open to them. So that's what this talk's about. I wanted to talk about my critical making experience or practices around some of the work I'm doing in social justice, using computational craft, and also being open about the shortcomings and how that's guiding my future work. Of course, research is never done and it'll never be perfect. So I just wanted to start with some definitions. So when I talk about critical making, I am using the Matt Ratto definition. I actually have never heard his last name, so I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, hopefully. And so I'll read this quote. Ultimately, critical making is about turning the relationship between technology and society from a matter of fact into a matter of concern. And that really resonated with me because, you know, having been through a number of different groups and social experiences with technology, and growing up with not no technology, but you know, computers being not something I've had since the beginning, it's really helped me be more aware of the changes that have happened. And it's critical making is really about critical thinking and physical making and putting them together. So a lot of my critical making is in relationship to stories, particularly whose stories are being heard and amplified, and also who is able to tell their stories. And so that ends up being a lot of the work I do. And then to talk about this term computational craft, there isn't quite one definition yet. And so I use it very broadly. So it's studying different ways in which crafting tools and processes are used in conjunction with technological tools and processes. And so I keep it very broad because I don't know, I don't want to gatekeep. So if somebody says it's computational craft, fantastic. But this can include things like e-textiles. Sometimes it's called hybrid craft forms, maker spaces, algorithmic crafting, and all sorts of these things. And one of the reasons why I find craft such a wonderful form to study, not only because of my own experiences, but because it's been used for a very long time as a subversive storytelling method. There are many stories about using craft as a way for women to be able to gather in spaces where they're not, they can be by themselves, as opposed to having to have their husbands there or these sorts of things. And so there's a number of instances of that as a community making, but also as making crafts in a subversive form, not only during the wars, but also telling stories that they didn't feel like they had a voice to tell in any other way. And so it makes a wonderful form of study, because there are all of these different ways historically and currently that storytelling is being done through craft. So with that framing in mind, I just wanted to look at 3 projects that I've been working on. And just depending on time, I'll see how quickly I need to go through these. But the first one is an example of procedural design for crafts. So this is using computation to procedurally generate designs. So if somebody needs a definition for procedural generation, please drop it in the chat, and I will go back and define it. But the idea is that the computer is making the design, and then a crafter would actually make the design in physical space. And so one of the examples of that is this project I called Embroidered Ephemera. So this is a procedural project that I created in which cross-stitch samplers are procedurally generated using tweets as input. And so the center image is a more traditional cross-stitch sampler, and the 2 images to the left and right are the ones that are generated from the computer program. And this was done as sort of a look at the juxtaposition between tweets, which people will type up for pretty much with a various amount of thinking before they actually post them. And then they very quickly can be lost, although they are kept around somewhere for a very long time. as opposed to cross-stitch samplers, which take hundreds of hours to make and last hundreds of years. And so it was this idea behind like these words that people are putting out there maybe without much thought. This is an interesting juxtaposition between these cross-stitch samplers where people would pick their very favorite, their favorite sayings or things that were important to them. And so as I got into this, I was, looking more at Twitter, and it's often critiqued as being casual and frivolous and also ephemeral. There's a study that found that there's over 9,000 tweets a second and over 545,000 in 1 minute. And so some of the critiques on Twitter is that this kind of very instant and thoughtless process leads to shit posts, slacktivism, and narcissism. But it's not always the case. There's actually a number of examples in which tweets have long-lasting consequences, including politicians keeping us out of war. And so it's kind of let's think about what we're tweeting. And so I already said this. So yeah, this is another example of an embroidery sampler from 1731. So just to give you an idea of how long these last. So like I said, the embroidered ephemera, it takes tweets based on let's see, you input either a handle or hashtag, and then it will find all the tweets by that person or with that hashtag in the last 30 days. And then it looks at the amount of engagement each tweet has. And so engagement being any reaction. So likes, retweets, quote retweets, and replies. And so it assumes that means that other people have placed importance on that tweet. And so it has a higher chance of picking a tweet that has higher engagement. And then I have a paper about all the design details if anybody's interested, but what I'm just high level, I'm using Google sentiment analysis, which I think is hilariously vague. And so basically you give it some text and it returns a number between 0 and 1. And I don't know, you're supposed to get meaning from that apparently. So what I was doing is using that as kind of an energy rating, because the sentiment analysis looked a lot at what words you used and exclamation marks and things like that. And so if something was considered lower energy, then I would choose color palettes that had lower activation colors. So blues and purples would be a low energy color scheme, whereas something that had more energy would be reds and oranges. And then there's borders that are also randomly generated, and those are the actual graphics are chosen from a library that I created. And the graphics themselves also have kind of this energy rating. So things that are very square or linear have a lower energy rating, whereas angles have the highest, and then curves are medium. And so the borders are picked based on, again, this energy rating. So you've got colors and borders. And then it also will look through all the tweets and store the 10 most used words that a person uses. It throws out the words like the and things like that. And it can sometimes make, it will include borders that include those words. So like this one here has, like casual here, and this one, papers, doctoral, computational creativity. So those are words that those accounts have used a lot. Okay, and so the outcomes of the system is, first of all, you can just sit there and generate a bunch of things, but some of them are comedic, some of them are very absurdist, and it can be enjoyable, but just to give you an example of some of the issues that I ran into. So the user experience of using this generator, like I said, you can just hit generate forever, and it's kind of fun. And again, you might get something that makes you laugh or whatever. So quite a few people have used this generator, but only one person has attempted to create the embroidery that the design has generated, and that person is me. And I thought this was very fitting because it is in fact very boring to do this. And so there's this unequal human labor required because, you know, it takes a couple seconds to make a tweet. And then I did an analysis. It was 1 hour per color per row to actually cross stitch this design. And it was like looking at the design, it was going to take over 300 hours. And I just couldn't see sitting with this tweet for 300 hours making this thing. Although the initial idea was to do ones from different political figures and kind of show visually the differences in tone that the different figures might have. And so it's just kind of, you need a very strong reason to do something that's going to take hundreds of hours. And I found that the software actually made the crafting less of a creative process because it's doing all the design, it's doing the fun parts. At that point, weirdly, the human becomes the machine in which you're just making this design that the computer has told you to do. And so, you know, the reason why I craft is for a creative outlet. And so having the computer do those fun parts was really problematic. And so that was just an issue I've been having with these creative, co-creative tools or creative tools that people have made that will generate designs. And it's an ongoing issue. They're very fun to code, but they're not actually that enjoyable to use as a crafter. And so the creativity ends up being at the curation level, right? Like you get all these designs, which one do you actually save? And it wasn't enough for, you know, hundreds of hours. So taking some of that and some other work that I've done, I was interested in how to combine craft with games. And, you know, initially we did some examples where the game was, you know, you played the game and it would generate some sort of design for a craft. And it would be personalized based on your choices in the game, which is what I was interested in. But again, nobody would make the designs because, again, it's not the interest. Like we have machines to be machines, not so we are the machines. And so I took what I learned from those, and I thought, well, what if you are creating a crafted artifact as you play, so as a byproduct of play. And so this is a collaboration with Sarah Hendricks, Bree Williams, and Josh McCoy, in which we decided to make this game, well, it's actually a controller, called Luminary. Hi, Zoe. And the idea behind it is, okay, let's have a crafted artifact be made by playing this game. And so this is a platform for playing twine games specifically. And the controller here is a rigid heddle loom. We've not actually changed the loom at all. The box it's sitting on is where all the electronics are stored. And we made changes to the heddle, which is the piece that the yarn is wrapped around. So here's how Luminary works. There are twine games that are written. In this case, we wrote most of them. And each of the options has a different color associated with it. So here the choices: approach the fountain, gaze upwards to the clouds, peek outside through the arches, or turn around and walk away. They're each a different color, and they're each associated with a yarn color. And so each of the shuttles, the thing with the yarn wrapped around it, has an RFID tag on it. And so we know which yarn goes with which RFID tag because we pre-wind those shuttles. And so, like I said, the box that it was sitting on, there's an RFID reader in that box. So as you weave, and the way you weave is you take this, the shuttle, and you pass it through these yarns, and you'll see that some are up and some are down. And then after you've passed it through, you move this heddle piece, which is this thing here, and it's got these plastic teeth in it. And you place it in a different position, which reverses where the yarns are. So now the yarns that were on the bottom are now on the top, and vice versa. And so that's how you weave. That's why you get these yarns that go every other, and then they change which ones are on top. So very simple. We chose a loom because it's one of the easier craft forms to teach people, and it's fairly easy to pick up. There's of course skill involved, but it's something that even if you haven't been doing it a long time, you can get results that are very enjoyable. And so I also want to talk about why we chose twine in particular. We had made some other games where we were trying out different controllers, like crafting processes as controllers. And if something is a fast or twitchy type of game experience, then crafting is generally not fast or twitchy. And so it can be really frustrating. So if you need to have like a very fast reaction, and yet it's going to take you a couple seconds to pass a shuttle through your yarns, it just doesn't match. It ends up not feeling very cohesive. It's not an enjoyable process. And so we wanted something that would slow people down. Also because of our RFID reader was kind of slow. And so twine just made perfect sense, because to read it, you have to slow down. And also twine, loom, obviously we had to go with that. Okay. So we did exhibit this in quite a number of places, and we found out a lot of things through this experience. What was interesting for me was that when playing, there was this tension that the players had between choices they wanted to make in the game versus design choices they wanted to make in the scarf they were creating. And so they might say something like, oh, I actually want to, go over here, but I really want to use that red yarn. And so I'm going to do that. And so that was something that we hadn't really considered before seeing people play it. And so that was really inspiring and interesting. And the other thing we noticed is in a number of the game exhibits that I've been to in the past, there is a tendency for when you're displaying a game for men to come forward and play and everybody else to kind of stand back and watch. And in this case, it was completely opposite, where the men were the ones that were standing back, and it was, women and children who were coming forward and sharing stories about weaving, family members that weave or looms that they've had. And it was this very social event, which was really wonderful. And it was also just interesting to show that if you just change the controller, it can really change who is comfortable using it. Let's see. So we thought that was really interesting. And, we have plans at some point to work on this some more. Of course, we both are now at different universities, and that makes it harder. I say both as in Josh McCoy was the professor who was leading the project at the other university I was working with. And we have both since moved to yet different universities, and we're just having trouble getting things lined up. The other thing I want to comment on, this is Sarah, who worked on the project, Sarah Hendricks. And this is her being excited after the 2-day show at the Smithsonian, where there are, I think, 26,000 people who came through. And, she was teaching thousands of people how to weave to use our game. So she was very excited when it was over. But it also highlights one of the issues. So the whole point of this project is we were interested in people being able to have a crafted artifact that showed their personal choices that they had made during a game experience to kind of annotate their player story versus, and I can get into that or not, depending on time. But the idea was that you would be able to have your crafted artifact and you could compare it with other people's, and you could actually be like, oh, you'd made that choice there, or it gave you a way to remember what you'd done and also compare with other people. Now you'll notice that Sarah is wearing the scarf. And this is what it was after a full weekend of playing. And that's kind of where the issue started coming in. There is only one Luminary controller in existence, which means that the only time you get to play it is at exhibits. And part of that is because it's expensive to make. The loom itself is a couple $100s, let alone the tech. And then to actually make a full scarf would take hours of play, like tens of hours of play. And so when you're in an exhibition setting, you're sitting down for maybe 5 minutes if if somebody has that much time. And it means that you're not going to have first of all, you won't have a scarf when you're done, but also there's, it'd be like this, like an inch or two of actual fabric that you've woven. And so in the end, we had this very lovely long scarf that had hundreds of people's of input on it, but we were the ones that had it at the end, which was completely opposite of what we wanted. And so that really didn't resonate well with us because that was not what we wanted with that. And I'll talk more about how we're addressing that in the future. But the last project I really wanted to touch on is looking at computational craft for education. And there's been a number of projects that have been done in which people have, taught K-12 STEM subjects using crafting. But what we are interested in is, and I say we, because this is a collaboration with Jillian Smith at Worcester Polytechnic Institute and a number of students. It's been going on for quite a few years, so there is a large number of students who have worked on this. And what we were interested in is adult education, leveraging craft knowledge for teaching, programming, or computational thinking. And so we started this project, and we've I'll go through where we're at, but I just want to talk about kind of my views of programming. Like I said, I am a programmer by initial trade, not current trade though, but I do view coding as a craft form. There's if you look at craft is defined by something that has the marks of the maker on it. There's a focus on material. And there's all of these, basically if somebody makes a craft, they'll make it slightly differently than the next person. And if you look at programming, nobody's programs are the same. Everybody approaches it differently. After, a few programming assignments, like I can tell which student wrote it just based on the style. Because it's that, people just leave their marks in their programming. And then there's also a focus on material, like which programming language are you going to use is something people really care about. But crafting is programming too. So these two programming languages here are actually patterns. Let's see, the one on the left is a crochet pattern, and and the one on the right is a knitting pattern. And so if you don't know the language, you cannot read it. And there's so many craft forms in which patterns are basically programs that humans follow. They're made for people to follow them. And the only difference is that when people follow patterns or programs, we tend to throw in our own changes and creative input, unlike a computer. So also, I wanted to say the output from running the pattern on the left, or the program on the left, is the scarf in the top right. or the cowl, and the output for running the program on the right is the pair of socks. And of course, somebody else who did this, it would look very different as output. So we, Jillian Smith and I, we created this project called CodeCrafters. And I forgot to put this, but it is partially funded by the NSF. Thank you, NSF. So what we were interested in is creating a series of workshops for adult quilters to help them leverage their expertise in quilting as like for learning. Initially, we wanted to do programming concepts, but we've sort of backed off from that. And now it's computational ideas and computational thinking. And so the idea is in these workshops, we make these, we not only point out what these similarities are, but we also have the quilters who are there go through a series of steps where they're actually practicing computational methods in their quilting. And what we ended up doing is creating this software. And this is version 1.0. It's about to get a redo because now that we know what needs to be on there, we're getting feedback on how to make it more usable for our audience. But we ran a focus group and I believe it's 2 workshops now, looking at how the participants, what their identity was when looking at computer science and computation, and also where there were any sticking points making that leap between the two. But the idea behind the software is that it is a quilt designer, and we're giving the users control over different constraints, including the colors and how often a certain shape is used when they're designing it. And so we follow a quilting method. So generally when making a quilt, people will pick their fabrics, then they'll make blocks, and then they'll turn their blocks into a quilt. And so that is the same process that this generator follows. And so the things that we found when looking at this is that, and I forgot to talk about the demographics. So the people that we tend to work with as quilters, the quilting groups that we are predominantly working with are made up of intergenerational groups of women with an average age of, I've forgotten, but it's like 40s or 50s. So it is slightly younger than the typical, I think the average quilter in the US is 64 years old. So it is slightly younger than that. They are predominantly white, predominantly women, and they are not necessarily interested in becoming programmers for a career. And so that's something that we are not, that's not what our program, like what our project is about. We're more interested in people getting a better understanding of how computation affects their lives in general from day to day. And so the things that we learned is that the quilters that we were working with, they felt like quilting was a learned skill, but that STEM and computer science and programming and technology was an innate skill. So something you're either born with or not, which is not true. And so, part of what we're doing with these workshops is trying to flip that script and get people to understand that it is something that you can get better at. They were very interested in using computation as a creative expression, and they were doing it already. So there were a number of people who are using software, computerized tools, etc., but they didn't necessarily recognize that that's what was happening. There is definitely some avoidance of computing that was present with our group. And we also learned that there was a very strong desire for time investment to include a tangible product. And so they would not be interested in having a computing class in which all they learned to do was program. What they wanted was to make something. which I totally understand. So that helped shape our workshops as well. And then there was a very big community influence on their motivation for learning. And so that's why we ended up doing workshops as opposed to one-on-one. It was just this idea behind having a community do it is just a very big driver for our demographic. And then they also pointed out that the systemic prejudice and its effects, like sexism, racism, and ageism, it's also in quilting, but it's even stronger when in STEM spaces. And so they didn't feel welcomed. And so, you know, most of the people we talked to had actually either tried learning programming in the past or had been in STEM related fields in the past, and only one person still was. And a lot of that was because of the way that they didn't feel welcomed there. So this has been a really interesting project and it's still ongoing. But one of the things that we are hyper aware of is that we are working with predominantly middle class, or actually upper middle class white women. And so one of the things we're interested in is how to take these workshops and look at refining them for different audiences with different goals. We're not looking to make one workshop that works for everybody, because I don't think that would be possible. And also just, it's ingenuous, but you know, we've been reaching out to quilt guilds that are made up of predominantly Black women or other people of color, and trying to figure out, you know, what their goals are and how to modify these workshops. And so we're going to be running a focus group very soon with them. So there's that, but I also want to talk a little bit more about, you know, other things that I am hoping to do in the future. So I mentioned that Luminary had this issue where you couldn't actually leave with the thing that you had made. So one of the things that our group has been looking at is how to create something that is for an exhibit. So we expect people to only spend a few minutes at the exhibit, but they can contribute to it. So it's collaborative storytelling, while also getting to keep the thing that they've made. And so one of the things we've been brainstorming about is this game called Mend, and it's not even remotely finished, but these are prototypes and concepts. And so the idea is that there is a constellation that is projected on a wall, and as people make things, it is added to the constellation. And so the idea is that somebody could come up to this installation piece, and then they could ask for a star to embroider, and a star would be drawn onto a piece of like a procedurally generated star would be drawn onto a piece of cloth that's appropriate for embroidery. And the reason why we're using embroidery is because it's very open to different embellishments and modifications. And so there's still a lot of creativity that goes into how you embroider it. What stitches do you use, and what colors do you use? And, you know, do you add things? Do you just follow the lines? Do you fill it in, et cetera? So there's just all of these different things. So it's much less about being the machine for the machine. It's also very fast as crafts go. So I'm just going to put that in perspective as crafts go. And so people could do it and sit down, and like you could sit down and make something in one sitting. And then we have a scanner that will scan it and then add it to this constellation piece that's being projected. All right. The other thing that I am super interested in, because of there's, you know, I was showing the similarities between crafting languages and programming languages, is looking at domain-specific programming languages that are made for quilters. And I don't know what that would look like. So I'm just going to be honest about that. But the idea is, when you teach programming, a lot of it is teaching people how to think like a computer. why do we do that? Why not have the programming languages meet people where they are? And so we want to create these languages that are sensitive to the values that crafters have, because we've been studying their values as well, and kind of incorporating that into the language itself. And then just, to bring it back to games, I don't have a slide for this, but the other thing I'm really interested in is creating an AI framework for games that has value sensitive design to crafting, because crafting systems and games have nothing to do with crafts, which is I actually have a whole nother talk about that. But it has a lot more to do, like a lot more in common with fighting mechanics than it does with crafting. So kind of looking at what would be required to support something much more like crafting in a video game. So there's many other avenues to explore, which is why I love my job. But I just wanted to say thank you. And I am open for questions, discussion, etc. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Oh, I was trying to unmute and I couldn't figure out how to do it. Thank you so much, Anne. I just figured it out. Maybe let's leave it up for a minute in case anyone wants to grab your information.
Sure.
But I wanted to say thank you for such a rich talk. I'm just like hung up on a few things, thinking about craft as subversive story methods, inverting this kind of the roles of the human and machine, creating artifacts as experiences happen, all these like amazing threads to your work. And then this idea of thinking about or opening the discussion on how computation affects our daily life to more people. I think we often take for granted the technology around us. Even made me think of the crash on Facebook yesterday and how how embedded that is to our lives. So I'm just thinking about all these things, and I just want to thank you because it was so rich and so much to think about. And I want to invite the audience to ask questions. You can put them in the chat. I'll make sure to open the chat window. Let me locate it.
Yeah, Bart actually asked if that was JavaScript or C++. In this case, I'm thinking the one you're looking at was JavaScript. I do a lot in JavaScript just because it's, I think it's a very expressive language and I find it really fun. So, but I am not necessarily, I use lots of different programming languages. But 2 thumbs up for JavaScript, especially with the P5.js library. Here, I'll write that down if anybody's interested. It makes it really easy to get graphics up on the screen and get things moving around and whatnot. So I really enjoy it.
Feel free. I know sometimes it takes a second to think about questions or write them up in the chat if that's what you're doing.
Yeah. Did I just stop sharing?
That's okay.
Yep. Okay. I can write it out in the chat too.
I'll paste some links in the chat too in a minute. But as I'm doing that, and while folks are thinking maybe of questions, and I know you mentioned this wasn't like the main goal of your work, but I thought it was interesting given, you shared a bit of your story at the beginning of the talk, being the only woman in a CS environment. And then you mentioned at the end how, or several times you mentioned in, when you were talking about Luminary, how women were coming forward, or more women and children coming forward to play with it. And at the end, thinking about the demographics for the quilting project. So it seems like maybe there's like a way that these games or these experiences might carve out or expand what still might be a male-dominated field in computer science today. I was wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I can speak a lot about that. Yeah, that's definitely something I've been interested in. Partly because, like I said, when I was a kid, I had no idea that programming was a career. I even got into it in college and didn't realize it was a career. It wasn't until I started looking for jobs where I was like, oh my God, I can make a lot of money doing this. Why did nobody tell me? And again, because my family grew up with such a finance focus, course, I fooled them. I ended up becoming a professor, but it's, but it was, it was something that I was very interested in, basically raising awareness that, hey, you can do this too. And I think because I got into it informally, I never really had those barriers of like, oh, programming is for boys. For me, it was just a thing I did because it was creative and fun. And so that's how I try to, I try to teach computer science like it is a craft form. It is something you do for creative expression. It's just another tool. But I'm also very aware of, how, I left the game industry at the height of the EA spouse lawsuits. And even at that time, there was, well, it's still a problem. Obviously, we've had Gamergate and other issues since then. But it's like, how much do I really want to encourage people to go into these fields that can be so toxic? And so that's an ongoing concern. And so part of what I'm doing now is actually looking at like, okay, your space sucks. How do we make a new space? You can have it. And I mean, I don't really mean that because I'm still a gamer. I still identify as a gamer, but I certainly don't want to participate in a lot of that area of socializing and whatnot. But I feel like if we show ways that computation and games can be interesting and effective in other areas, the more people will see not only the range of what it can do, but maybe make spaces that are more supportive and less toxic. So it's kind of a twofold thing.
That's so interesting thinking too. Yeah, inviting people into a toxic space, if that's really what we want to do. I think this idea of creating new spaces is so like valuable to think about, and how we create those spaces. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Pull up the, I'm on my iPad and I can't tell if the chat is going or not.
I have the chat up.
Okay.
Everyone's being very quiet.
Everyone's absorbing.
That's fine.
Yeah. I was also, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I can go get Zoe if it's helpful.
No, she's so cute. Saw her climbing over you and I was like, oh. I was also going to ask, maybe for our students who are in the audience, you mentioned a little bit about your process in terms of testing your, there may be something in the chat, which might be a better, I'll let someone else ask a question before I ask.
Evelyn asked if that's a quilt behind me. Yes, it is. And thank you. It used to change more regularly, but I've gotten very lazy about it. It's just a fun way to like, I have all these quilts and I'm not using them. That's the problem with being a crafter, is you end up making all of this stuff and your friends are like, please do not give me any more things. And so it's like, well, what do I do with them? Just hang them up. Asayo, I hope I pronounced that correct. Asks, I know you said you picked the wrong class by accident, so why did you decide to continue along that path instead of going back into your intended career path? Yes, that's a great question. Partly because they didn't have wildlife conservation, I ended up doing biology, which I did not like. I wanted to work with wolves. That was my, like, ever since I found out I couldn't grow up to be a cat, I was like, okay, fine, I'm gonna save the wolves. So I'm still hoping they'll figure out how to grow up to be a cat though. But so I ended up in biology, and I just wasn't very good at it. Like, it was a lot of memorization, which I am really terrible at. It wasn't until later that I was diagnosed with ADHD, and now I understand why I was so terrible at it. But I ended up failing my biology class, like the third quarter biology class, the same time that I took my first programming class, which I loved. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is great. I just want to do this. And so it was kind of a existential crisis moment, but in the end, I was like, okay, I don't even want to do the biology. There was a lot of other stuff that was happening in like biology labs that was really traumatic for me. So anyway, I ended up doing computer science, and it ended up working out for me. Let's see. Oh, there's more. Oh my gosh, hi, Sabine. Sharvi says, I really like how you approach coding. Thank you. I had a hard time putting that into action, and I realized I need to switch majors from computer science to something into design. Yeah, it wasn't until I got into digital media, which is a lot of humanities plus computer science, that I was like, yes, okay, finally, this is where I belong. And that didn't happen until I was a professor. So you have time. Sabine, thank you for this brilliant talk. Oh, thank you. And for sharing your wonderful cat with us. Zoe says, thank you. Have you taught any classes on critical making your projects? I have not. Well, sort of. If so, what are responses by students and or challenges? So that's a fantastic question. I have not taught specifically critical making. I should ask what audience you mean. Do you mean like a quilting audience? Zoe, that's rude. Do you mean a quilting audience or like a college class? Because at college I have taught, I teach computers as an expressive medium, and I have them do 3 critical making projects. I actually have them read the chapter that quote from Matt Bratto is in, and we follow like the 5-step process that Garnet has in there, Garnet Hertz, about how to do critical making. And so we do one around narrative, one around procedural, like procedural design, and one around physical interfaces. So students, the responses by students, they really enjoy it, although they have trouble with it at the beginning. But by the end of the semester, they're often like, I can't look at things without thinking about them through a critical lens. And I'm like, my job is done. So.
Amazing. Yeah, I was, my question was about academic context actually, because funnily enough, I'm going to teach a course next year about critical making, also from a play or like game design lens. So it's just like wondering what your experiences are in this area, and like what, again, like how to get students into this mindset of critical thinking, because I guess that's like the major challenge here.
Yeah, no, it's so I'm happy to send you my syllabus. It is a grad class, but I am incorporating it into my some of the stuff into my undergraduate game design class that I'm teaching this semester. But what I do is I have them read like the core reading for whatever topic we're covering. And it's usually from some old white dude. And then I'll have them read a selection of critical papers that, I make sure have no white dudes in it, but also, sorry, white dudes, but also making sure that there's a wide range of voices. So BIPOC, LGBTQIA, women, etc. And so that already gets them thinking critically. And we talk about, like in the discussions, we'll talk about like how that applies to what we're doing. But yeah, it's mostly just having them do it a lot.
Yeah,
it's super fun though.
I would really love it.
Yeah, I'll totally share. I'm happy to share.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Let's see, Jason. We need more women, people of color, and queer folk in STEM. Agreed. Isabel also agrees. Yeah, we need them in STEM, but we also need them to stay, which we have not figured out. That's the hard part. Like there's a lot of studies that have shown that a lot of people are leaving STEM, and they're predominantly women, people of color, and queer people. So, not to say that all the environments are toxic, but it's hard to find the ones that aren't. So, did you have a question, Laura? I feel like you were asking one and it got interrupted.
Oh, Yeah, I was going to ask one for our students, but I let the questions that were asked were better than mine, so that's great. I was, you mentioned at some point in terms of process and like testing your ideas and your games, and so I thought maybe it would be interesting for our students to hear a little bit about that process from you as well.
Oh yeah, sure. So I'm laughing because the first thing I think about is during my PhD, in which we were making games, we were making AI frameworks that we would, and then make a game to kind of show that our AI frameworks worked. And to test them, we would make AI bots. So we didn't actually ever want people to play our games because you cannot trust people. And so it cracked me up when I finally got out of CS and was like, oh my God, people actually talk to people. Amazing. That blows my mind. So yeah, nowadays we do a lot of user studies. And so, yeah, I haven't actually done any, so most of the game research I've been doing lately has been more game theory, which is more about looking at like coding up things that you find online and finding similar, themes and whatnot. But for instance, for the workshops that we're doing for CodeCrafters, we started with like very, very common HCI process. We started with a survey, and we had, I think, 650 respondents. And we didn't know how surveys worked at the time because we were still new to all of this. And so we had all of these qualitative questions in there. And so some poor students had to spend a summer going through and coding 650 people worth of responses. And then we did some interviews initially to get ideas for the first round of software. And then we had a focus group for talking about the workshop in particular. And from there, we did a few rounds of the software, a few rounds of workshops, like designing wise, and then we piloted both, and then actually did some informal surveys, user studies of the software. And then now we're doing just to get it going for the workshop. And now we're doing a more formal user study this semester of the software. And we're taking all of our, like the workshops, we have, all of this, the discussion from them. Also, we talk to people afterwards. And so we're taking all of that to figure out how to design them more in the future. And we had talked about doing participatory design initially, but in the end, I forget why we chose not to. I think it was because of COVID, honestly. We had all our workshops like ready and designed, and then COVID, and so we had to go back and redesign them entirely. But yeah, we definitely want to include more feedback from the audience we're working with. Hi, Michael. Let's see, could you go into some of your methods of critical reflection? Sorry, Laura, did that answer your question? I don't know how much detail you wanted.
No, okay. No, thank you. That was great. I just thought it would be great to hear about your process and share with the students. I appreciate that. Yeah, no I'm worries. Also in a shared space, so
no worries.
I'll be hearing.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay.
It's methods of critical reflection. I can share the 6-step process we use. It is based on Phoebe Singer's work. And so let's see, I'm trying to find the assignment with the thing. So this is something that we like, these are questions that we ask ourselves when we're making the project, and also like as we continue, we'll continue to ask these questions. Let's see here. I'm just trying to find something that's got them easily available. we go. So this is just the first 3 steps. There's actually 5, but the 4th and 5th one are about deploying and iterating, which we don't have time to do in class. There should be numbers there. Sorry. But the idea is, I mean, I can just go over this. So the idea is that when making a project, the first thing that we do is we identify kind of what are the assumptions and metaphors that are commonly used. So for instance, if we're looking at interactive narrative, one of the assumptions may be that, I mean, there's a lot of assumptions, right? You've got assumptions that, first of all, people have computers that can run these things, that people have the ability to read English, because most of the ones we're doing are in English. That, you know, the stories are often like very commonly interactive narratives, the stories are told in second person. And that, you know, the choices should matter, or the story should change based on your choices. Anyway, so we just kind of do a little bit of brainstorming around that. And then we look at, and if somebody has a specific story that they want to tell, we'll look at the assumptions of that specific story, which actually a lot of them end up doing. So somebody was, like one of the assignments that actually just got turned in, somebody was looking at the heroes, like a typical hero story, especially as told in like a superhero movie. And one of the assumptions there is that the hero is a good guy, right? And so so that's step 1. Step 2 is to flip that and kind of think through, or step 2 is to think through who that is excluding, and you know, where are the shortcomings of that? And then step 3 is to flip it. So step 2, she was like, okay, well, are superheroes really not doing anything bad? And so she pointed out that in a lot of superhero movies, there's a lot of destruction that happens, but because it's happening to people that are not the main character, it's just completely irrelevant. Like they don't even ever address it. And so she ended up flipping that. So then the centering of it was the person who had actually had their neighborhood destroyed by a superhero, and kind of their experience of that, and then seeing the person like constantly like, ooh, look, our hero on TV and whatnot, and like what that would be like. And so that's just an example of using that critical process.
That's amazing. Now I'm thinking about that.
I'll let her know.
Yeah. If there are any more questions, free to put them in the chat. I'm going to hang a couple minutes just to make sure.
Sure thing.
Thank you, Anne, again for just such a wonderful talk, and such a great openness in the Q&A and in your talk in general. So appreciative of your time.
Thank you so much for the invitation.